All right, first of all, making bias tape is an easy way to, kind of make sure your bias tape matches your fabric. When your material you use to make bias tape out of should be rather slim, okay? You don't want to use a heavy fabric for bias tape because it's going to get folded a couple times and it's going to get really bulky really fast, okay? This is a medium weight linen. I'm going to go ahead and use it because this is the same stuff I made my doublet from. It's going to get a little bit bulky, but I'm willing to deal with it. I would suggest either a handkerchief weight linen or a cotton broadcloth or anything else like that. I would not use satin, silk, or anything slippery. It's going to be a pain in the butt enough, dealing with this little thin thing, we call bias tape. Use something that you can actually get a grip on. So slippery fabrics are not good fabrics for bias tape. What I've done is I've got a square of fabric. Now, how big the square is completely up to you. This one happens to be a 25-inch square. All right? I wouldn't use a little square of fabric because then you get a lot of seams. But a larger rectangle can be a little bit more difficult to use. Just depends on the width of your fabric and everything else like that. I basically, since I had, 50-inch wide fabric, with a 25-inch square. That's all. It was just easiest to cut out two squares like that. What I've done is, you can see this is my, straight grains, my warp and my weft. I've drawn a line, corner to corner, along the bias. All right. Then I'm going to cut that like that. Alright, once I get this cut, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to move this piece over here, and I'm going to sew the two together just like that, okay? Alright, now I've actually got one already sewn, so I'm just going to move this aside for real quick. Yes, it's just like those cooking shows. I've already got it all set up. Alright, so this was our square that I just cut this piece. I sewed it to that side. I used a 1/2-inch seam allowance, just like I always do, but I used a very short stitch. I'm talking like a 1 out of 4. Okay, almost a buttonhole length stitch. It's a very, very short straight stitch on my machine. It's because I'm going to be cutting across this seam when I cut my bias, okay? And so if I have a longer seam, it's going to want to unravel. Using a short seam, it's not as good as locking the stitch in place, but it's close enough for our purposes and everything else like that. You can use a double straight seam. It's just going to make your seam a little bit bulky. So like I said, just use a very, very short seam, okay? Now if I rotate this, you can see we now have biased lengths of fabric here, okay? What I did is I marked one of the points at about a 1/2 inch down from the edge, okay? Over here by the seam, I marked it at a 1/2 inch, and then the width of my bias tape that I want to make, which happens to be 2 inches. Remember, we're going to take this bias tape, we're going to fold it in half, and then we're going to fold those halves into quarters. So it's eventually going to, end up looking like a taco, okay? If this was the middle of my, if this was the edges of my bias tape, I fold it in half, and then I fold those halves in, and it folds over just like that. That's how we get a double fold in our bias tape. All right? So if I want 1/2 inch wide bias tape, well, 1/2 times 4 is 2 inches. Okay? So however wide you want your bias tape, multiply times 4, and that's how wide you're going to make this mark. So I marked it at a 1/2 inch from the edge. That's so I can get rid of that raw edge. Just cut that off later. And then I went 2 inches down. Now here's where the fun magic comes. I'm actually going to match this up. And I'm going to offset it. I'm going to take that top line that I marked. I'm going to match it up to that second line that I marked over here. What that's going to create is this offset tube, All right, once I sew it, and from there I'm going to be able to mark a spiral on this tube that will be along the bias edge. And when I cut this, it's just going to be one big long coil. It's pretty neat. So we're going to cut the video right now. I'm going to pin and sew this edge, and then I'm going to mark it, and then I'm going to cut it out just so you guys can see it. All right? I'll show you the markings before I cut, but it takes a little while, so we're going to cut the video right here, and then we're going to come right back to this in about 10 minutes, okay? All right.
2.
All right, so as you can see, I've sewn these together, and it basically created a tube that's kind of offset. You can see it's offset. On this tube, I drew a spiral. It's kind of hard to see, pink chalk on green thread, but you can see I basically just spaced the lines 2 inches apart. All right, and now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cut the spiral out. So I just start at the top with my scissors, and I just start cutting. Now I want to make sure I'm only cutting one layer of fabric. It's very easy on this to cut the other layer. So make sure you're lifting up, and make sure you just don't cut the layer underneath. This is especially for David. Okay? You have to be very careful as you cut so that you can pull this off. Now this takes a little while to cut, but as you cut, what's going to happen, as you can see, it's just creating a nice set of 2-inch wide bias strips with an angled seam, so that when we sew our bias on, the seam edges never match up with each other, so it reduces the bulk as we sew. So, I mean, oops. Yeah, you gotta watch your chalk lines, and make sure you draw accurate chalk lines. As we go round and around here, it gets a little bit tedious. But I mean, you want to be, fairly accurate. But if you get a little off here and there, that's okay. You're not gonna have too much trouble making up the difference as you sew on your bias tape. Now, some people will iron folds into bias tape. You can do that. They have little devices that you can buy, little feet that you can buy that you can actually pull along the strip, and it will actually fold it for you. I actually have a little machine that will press and fold it at the same time. It's really cool. But in reality, you don't even have to do that, because when I show you how we're going to sew this on, probably next class, you will see as we sew it on, we can create folds in it as we sew it on. So we really don't need to press it. Some people, like I said, like to. If I do press it, I usually only press one side of it. And that's just 1/4 of it, for that, just one side. But that's just me. I don't want to iron that much. I iron what's necessary, but I mean, come on, don't get off that much. Flip, yes, you have to keep flipping it. You have to make sure you're not getting your tape tangled up, because you don't want to cut it off. But this is why I started that first line at least 1/2 inch away from one edge, so that I have a little bit of wiggle room. You don't want to start your measurement of your 2-inch strips directly from one edge. You want to give yourself a little bit of wiggle room so that you can. You don't, because if you get a little off, it's difficult. And again, you can see I'm cutting right through these seams that I sewed. That's why I use such a short stitch. Because, yeah, otherwise these seams would be pulling apart right now and everything else like that. I'm almost done. And we're going to measure this to see how much actual bias tape we got from a 25-inch square. Okay, almost there. And this is just the last little bit. Just want to make sure it's 2 inches all the way down. Obviously, this little bit that I'm cutting off right now, this is just to make the bias tape even, and it will be cut off and thrown away because it's, just a little piece of strip of fabric. So. Alright, so let's just cut that off right now. Need that. Let's see how much we ended up with. Now my table is 1 yard, so that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, a little bit more than 8 yards of bias tape from one 25-inch square. So that's pretty cool. You don't need a lot of fabric to make a lot of bias tape. I mean, that was less than a yard of fabric. It wasn't even the full width of the fabric. And so if you figure I had got two 25-inch squares, I can make 16 yards of bias tape from that. That's more than enough for 90% of projects. Even yours, Bobby, is not going to require much more than 15 yards of bias tape. Okay, even with the spiral sleeves. So you can get a lot of bias tape for not a lot of money. A yard of fabric, especially like a broadcloth, is not going to cost a lot. And you can get bias tape in any color you want in. In fact, we actually dyed some linen for a project once that we needed to match the color, and we couldn't find a color that matched, so we bought some white linen and we dyed it, and it worked just fine. So, I mean, whatever you need to do to get your bias tape, that's what it works. So easy, cheap way to get bias tape. All right, and it's witchcraft.